To all of you, I offer the peace and joy of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Pope John Paul II was not alone as he lay on his deathbed in his Vatican apartment on the last day of his life. Beneath his third-floor windows, where the lights stayed on throughout the chilly early spring night, thousands of young pilgrims kept vigil with their beloved Holy Father, praying and singing to express their affection to the dying Pope. The loud clanging of a Vatican bell mourned his passing. In the Apostolic Palace, the ritual of recognition and the blessing of his remains took place, followed by the destruction of his ring and the sealing of his apartments. Then, the chamber in the basilica was opened, and an estimated 3 million people came to pay him homage. Many world leaders attended his funeral, putting aside their disputes for a few hours to pay tribute to a common friend, his tomb in St. Peter's Basilica is now one of the most visited places by pilgrims. For many, John Paul II is more than a saint. He is a father, a friend, and an intercessor. And in his final moments, he revealed a meaningful message that shocked the world. A mysterious message left by Pope John Paul II has stirred the curiosity of millions. Was it a prophetic warning about the end of times? John Paul II's health began to decline 2 months earlier, on the night of February 1st, 2005, when he was urgently hospitalized at Gemelli Hospital with breathing difficulties, the flu, and a swollen throat. For weeks, this hospital in Rome became a pilgrimage destination, with hundreds of people visiting just to be near him. John Paul II often greeted them from the 10th floor window of the clinic. At the end of February, he underwent an emergency tracheotomy. Although he could no longer speak, he continued to see pilgrims. That year, the Pope was unable to attend the Easter ceremonies, and he continued to struggle with severe illness until he passed away. May our prayerful silence accompany these first moments of the Holy Father John Paul II with Christ in heaven. Pope John Paul II was a man of great spiritual and moral stature, whose influence was felt far beyond the Roman Catholic Church. As he approached his final moments, the words he chose to leave behind were full of mystery and depth, fueling the curiosity and reflection of millions. These were not just the words of a man who knew his death was near, but a well-thought-out message that encapsulated his life's teachings and his profound link with the divine. Understanding his last message offers a glimpse into the faith that guided him and the legacy he left behind. In the last chapter of his life, Pope John Paul II faced serious health problems that limited his physical activities but never his spiritual determination. Despite the debilitating effects of Parkinson's disease, which the public could see through his slurred speech and shaky movements, he continued to carry out his duties with great resolve. This perseverance, in the face of illness, revealed his deep commitment to his role and to the people who sought his guidance. John Paul II's health problems became more visible in 2005 when flu symptoms and breathing difficulties resulted in several hospitalizations. These health scares were evidence of his declining physical condition, which worried his followers across the world. The Vatican's confirmation of his Parkinson's disease made his struggles public, highlighting his vulnerability and humanizing him even more in the eyes of the world. Even as his body weakened, his will to be a spiritual leader remained unchanged. During this period, the Pope chose to stay in the Vatican, a clear sign of his wish to spend his last days in the spiritual center of his life's work. His choice was a touching testament to his devotion to his position and the people he served. Despite his deteriorating health, even to the point of severe septic shock that eventually led to his demise, John Paul II maintained his pastoral mission. This further proved that his spirit remained strong. His medical report stated the cause of death as septic shock with cardiocirculatory collapse due to a previously detected infection of the urinary tract. As the end of the Pope's life approached, tens of thousands of people gathered in St. Peter's Square to hold a vigil in his honor. On April 2nd, 2005, at approximately 3:30 p.m., he uttered his last words in his native Polish. Let me go to the house of the Father. These simple yet profound words summed up his lifelong dedication to his faith and his willingness to meet his Creator. Hours later, he fell into a coma and eventually passed away, leaving behind a world that loved him not only as a pope, but also as a symbol of hope and moral strength. In his last message, released after his death, Pope John Paul II emphasized the theme of divine mercy, a central tenet of his theological teachings throughout his papacy. This message was grounded in the Christian tradition of forgiveness and reconciliation, as expressed in the biblical passage where the resurrected Jesus appears to his disciples and shows them his wounds. This event was a testament to his resurrection and a profound representation of love and sacrifice, themes that John Paul II highlighted in his final words. His message centered on the transformative power of God's mercy, which he believed could change hearts, mend divisions, and create peace among peoples and nations. Through the story of doubting Thomas, whom Jesus called to touch his wounds, John Paul II underscored the importance of belief and trust in the face of divine mystery. He used this narrative to inspire a deeper and more profound understanding of divine mercy. Today, Jesus, I trust in you. Have mercy on us and on the whole world, he said, summing up his plea for divine mercy. John Paul II was always in touch with people of different faiths and backgrounds, spreading a message of unity and common purpose based on love and compassion. His idea of divine mercy was also a call for the world to receive this love and express it through acts of kindness, forgiveness, and solidarity. His teachings urged people to look beyond their own interests, to seek justice, and to be peacemakers in a world full of challenges. Through his words and actions, Pope John Paul II showed how embracing divine mercy could bring about significant changes in personal lives and the wider world, fostering a spirit of reconciliation and mutual respect. Pope John Paul II's encounters with assassination attempts further demonstrated his dedication to peace and reconciliation. On May 13, 1981, in St. Peter's Square, he faced a life-threatening moment when Mehmet Ali Agca, a member of the Turkish extremist group Grey Wolves, shot at him with a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The bullets caused severe injuries, puncturing his colon and small intestine multiple times. Despite suffering massive blood loss, John Paul II survived after extensive surgery. This event was extraordinary not only due to his survival but also because of his response. 2 years after the attempt on his life, John Paul II visited Agca in prison. This meeting was held in secrecy, creating a deeply intimate moment of forgiveness. The Pope referred to Agca as a brother and publicly stated that he had pardoned him. This act of forgiveness embodied his doctrine, which emphasizes forgiving those who wrong us, a principle deeply rooted in Christian teachings. It was a powerful example of compassion and mercy that impressed the world and reinforced his position as a peacemaker. This was not the only attempt on his life. However, after each incident, John Paul II's commitment to his mission of peace and reconciliation only grew stronger. His readiness to forgive and pursue peace, even with those who had harmed him, exemplified his character and his unwavering belief in the Christian doctrine of love and forgiveness. During his papacy, he was a staunch advocate for peace, frequently using his influence to mediate disputes and urging dialogue. The canonization of John Paul II on April 27, 2014, was a significant event in the history of the Catholic Church. It was a testament to his immense influence as a spiritual leader and a sign of the deep love and respect he commanded worldwide. Recognizing his monumental contributions to the Church and the world, Pope Francis expedited the canonization process, which usually takes 5 years after a person's death. This action highlighted the unique nature of John Paul II's papacy and his enduring legacy. John Paul II's sainthood was confirmed by the verification of 2 miracles attributed to his intercession. The first involved the healing of a French nun with Parkinson's disease, the same condition that John Paul II battled in the last years of his life. The second miracle concerned a Costa Rican woman who was cured of a brain aneurysm after praying for his intervention. These events, seen by the Vatican as divine confirmations of his sanctity, underscored his ongoing spiritual presence and influence. In addition to the miracles, John Paul II's legacy is rich in his tireless advocacy for peace, his philosophical writings, and his efforts to bridge gaps between different faith communities. He was renowned for his ability to connect with people on a personal level, often speaking in their native language during his travels and addressing the young, the suffering, and the marginalized directly. His warmth and genuine concern for people's well-being left a lasting impression, creating a sense of kinship and closeness with those he met. The title John Paul the Great, sometimes used in discussions about him, reflects the vast impact he had. This title, rarely given, signifies the profound and lasting changes he brought to the Catholic Church and global discourse. His teachings and actions were instrumental in shaping Catholic social teaching in the latter part of the 20th century, and his influence continues to be felt in discussions on religion and public life today. After St. John Paul II's death on April 2, 2005, the massive crowd at his funeral chanted Santo Subito for the well-traveled, much-beloved Pope. Long before Pope Francis earned the nickname Saint, John Paul II was known as the People's Pope. Saint John Paul II recognized the value of modern travel and mass media in spreading the gospel and a global message of goodwill. He also used his personal visits to reinvigorate local church communities and canonized more saints than any pope in history. During his more than a quarter century on the chair of Peter Saint, John Paul II published numerous important documents in the life of the Church. John Paul II dealt lethal blows to many dictatorships. With the exception of communist Cuba, most countries in Latin America today enjoy democracy. Today, Chile is a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Rich Countries Club, while Brazil's middle class has soared by 40% in the past decade. In 1978, however, that was not the case. Most countries in the region were ruled by ruthless military dictatorships. In 1987, John Paul II visited Chile, where he made many gestures supporting the pro-democratic opposition and asked the country's dictator, General Augusto Pinochet, to step down. A few months later, Pinochet held a referendum asking the Chilean people if they wanted a return to civilian rule, which they did. Meanwhile, in 1983, the pontiff visited Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, then ruled by the extravagant dictator Baby Doc Duvalier. John Paul condemned the poverty and political violence, and shortly thereafter, the Haitians rose up and drove Duvalier out of the country. In addition to Latin America, John Paul II's visit to the Philippines, then ruled by dictator Ferdinand Marcos, influenced the local church to lead a successful nonviolent revolution against the dictatorship. The late Archbishop of Manila, Cardinal Jaime Sin, the informal leader of the Philippine People Power Revolution, said he was inspired above all by John Paul II and solidarity. The Church's relationship with other religions has changed forever. Before the Second Vatican Council, relations between Catholics and Jews were quite strained. Until the pontificate of St. John XXIII, Catholics prayed for the conversion of the perfidious Jews during the Good Friday liturgy. Today, relations between the Church and the Jews are arguably the best they have been in 2,000 years. St. John Paul II became the first pope to make an official visit to a synagogue, to establish diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Israel, and to condemn anti-Semitism as a sin. Repeatedly during his pontificate, John Paul proved to be a friend of the Jewish people. When the pontiff died, the Jewish world was in mourning, feeling it had lost a brother and protector. Similarly, he became the first pope to visit a Protestant church, the dignitary who had the most audiences with St. John Paul II was the Dalai Lama. The Polish Pope and the Tibetan Buddhist monk both came from ancient nations that experienced communist oppression imposed by their powerful neighbors, and so they seemed to share a special ecumenism of blood. Christian unity, while still a long way off, is closer than ever before. I make an effort to regularly pray for the unity of all Christians, and if you do not, I encourage you to do so as well. God desires unity, not division. While the prospects of this actually happening anytime soon seem unlikely, St. John Paul II certainly moved things forward. Earlier this year, Pope Francis traveled to Armenia, the world's oldest Christian nation, where most people belong to the Armenian Apostolic Church. There, he signed an agreement with Catholicos Karikian II, in which the two men agreed to work toward full communion between their respective churches. This would not have been possible without a declaration signed between John Paul II and the previous Catholicos, in which they agreed on a shared definition of Christ's nature, the biggest theological obstacle to full communion between Rome and Echmiadzin, where the headquarters of the Armenian Apostolic Church is located. In the life of Pope John Paul II, we can see a man sent by God, prepared by him, and made bishop and pope to guide God's church. John Paul II brought the gospel to more people than anyone since St. Peter. In all likelihood, St. John Paul II was seen by more people in person than any other figure in world history. He not only traveled widely across Italy and visited almost all of Rome's parishes as pope, he is also the Bishop of Rome and Primate of Italy, but also visited 2/3 of the world's countries. As we saw earlier, his visits to communist Poland and nations governed by military dictators had enormous political consequences. Difficult political situations were no deterrent to papal travel. For example, John Paul II was the only major head of state to visit East Timor during its brutal occupation by Indonesia. Consequently, many East Timor's men born after the visit are named John Paul. However, John Paul II made a point of not only visiting countries on the peripheries but also of bringing the gospel to rich nations threatened by the cult of Mammon. After his native Poland, the nations John Paul II visited the most were France, which over the past 2 centuries had rejected its ancient Christian roots, and the United States. Even nations with tiny Catholic populations, like Jamaica and Finland, were honored with papal visits. He invented World Youth Day, which is bringing about real rejuvenation where the Church needs it most. When Pope John Paul II decided to hold World Youth Day in Denver in 1993, the American bishops begged him to reconsider. Young Americans don't care about their faith, they argued, and the event will be a big public relations flop. How wrong they were. While vocations to the priesthood and religious life in the United States are at a lower level than they were 50 years ago, they have picked up significantly in recent years after reaching a low point in the mid-1990s, right before World Youth Day was held stateside. Since 1/3 of current American seminarians have cited wide as an influence on their vocation, this correlation cannot be coincidental. World Youth Day in Sydney in 2008 proved to be a similar booster shot to the Church in Australia, where vocations and youth engagement in Catholicism are on the rise. Post-Catholic Spain has also seen a growth in vocations since WIDE 2011 in Madrid. Both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis have continued to celebrate World Youth Day, and it looks like the event is here to stay. Meanwhile, the Church will continue reaping the good fruits. The papacy became a voice that matters in the world. Encompassing an area of 109 acres, the Holy See is the world's smallest state. Central Park in New York City is almost 8 times larger. However, thanks to St. John Paul II, this tiny Vatican microstate has arguably gained the most global influence since the Renaissance. How many divisions has the Pope's Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin once famously said, scoffing at the notion that the Roman priest monarch could have any real impact on the world? John Paul II proved Stalin wrong. From Poland to El Salvador, his travels often had explosive consequences. When John Paul II spoke at the United Nations or at the European Parliament, people listened. He gave a bold example of uncompromising leadership, something rare in our world. The late British journalist and intellectual and Catholic convert Malcolm Muggeridge once said that only dead fish swim with the stream. Most political leaders today are dead fish, changing their minds based on what the polling data says. John Paul II, however, was always true to his convictions. He did not care if the op-ed pages of The Guardian, La Repubblica, or the New York Times criticized his defense of the unborn, or if Condoleezza Rice was disappointed that the Pope did not back the invasion of Iraq. To the late Pope, the Gospels, and not current trends, were what mattered most. The final chapter of John Paul II's pontificate was perhaps the most countercultural. Today, we live in an age that glorifies physical beauty and youth and is afraid of suffering. Most people want to be like Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's famous novel and remain young and beautiful forever. In most Western countries, the vast majority of children with Down syndrome are killed in the womb. There is growing support to legalize euthanasia, not only for the terminally ill but also for those who simply have become weary of living. On the contrary, John Paul II embraced his suffering and illness from Parkinson's disease and other ailments. His disease and death were very public. This resonated in hearts around the world, as evidenced by the millions who flocked to Rome in the spring of 2005 to attend the largest funeral in human history. Three particular traits mark the life of John Paul II: prayer, closeness, and mercy. Despite his many duties as Pope, John Paul II always found time to pray. Saint. John Paul II was also close to the people, not detached or separated from them, but traveling the whole world to seek them out. Already in the Old Testament, we can see how God was uniquely close to his people. This closeness culminated in the Incarnation, when Jesus himself dwelt among his people. John Paul followed the example of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, drawing near to both the great and the small, to those close by and those physically far away. Saint. John Paul II was remarkable for his love of justice, but his love for justice was a desire for justice completed by mercy. And so John Paul was also a man of mercy, because justice and mercy go together. John Paul, who did so much to promote the divine mercy devotion, believed that God's justice had this face of mercy, this attitude of mercy. John Paul II died carrying a heavy cross. He carried it with dignity, but he also carried it according to the principles of Catholic bioethics, refusing disproportionate means when his time to go to the house of the Father had clearly arrived. Remember, John Paul II was a good shepherd to us all, as are all men of Christ. It is up to those remaining to pick up the torch and carry it further down the road of Christ. The fire of God's love, like any great fire, spreads on contact. One tree ignites the next, and that sets the next ablaze. A tiny spark can set a whole forest alight. That's what a soul in love with God can do, and what Jesus is longing for. But those who want to set the world on fire with the love of God may have to fight many battles. All saints have had to struggle against the resistance of those who hate that fire because they hate the light of the gospel. Saints are strong. They are ready for the spiritual battle. God has made saints out of sinners, but never out of wimps. Saint John Paul II, whose feast day we celebrate on October 22nd, is a good example of this. The Nazi occupation forces closed his university, and young Karol had to work in a quarry and in the Solvay chemical factory for 5 years. During that time, aware of his call to the priesthood, he began courses in the clandestine seminary of Krakow. When he became a priest, the communists spied on him. At the age of 60, an assassin shot him, and he nearly died. As an old man, he suffered from an intestinal tumor, a femur fracture, and the debilitating Parkinson's disease that rendered him immobile, distorted his physical appearance, and finally took away his ability to speak. It doesn't look like the story of a powerful man. However, he changed the world with the fire of the love of God that he had in his heart. Saint John Paul II inspired many countries in Eastern Europe to turn away from communism. His zeal for the gospel took him on apostolic trips all over the world. Neither illnesses, Nazis, communists, nor bullets could stop that flame because it's a divine fire. Saints are not wimps. Mary, Queen of all saints, Help us to be strong and reliable so that we can serve your Son and spread this divine fire. During his life and papacy, Saint John Paul II often spoke against the problems of secular culture. Many of these challenges still exist in our world today, which makes his wisdom on various topics timeless. The world tells us that love can be confined to a greeting card or box of chocolates, or worse, that love is a fickle feeling rather than a virtuous decision. As Christians, we are called to love beyond a secular standard and to love like Christ, as Saint John Paul II teaches. What really matters in life is that we are loved by Christ and that we love him in return. In comparison to the love of Jesus, everything else is secondary, and without the love of Jesus, everything is useless. In the life of Pope John Paul II, we see a man sent by God, prepared by him, and made bishop and pope to guide God's church. Despite his many duties as pope, John Paul II always found time to pray. Saint John Paul II was also close to the people, not detached or separated from them, but traveling the whole world to seek them out. Already in the Old Testament, we see how God was uniquely close to his people. This closeness culminated in the Incarnation when Jesus himself dwelt among his people. John Paul followed the example of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, drawing near to both the great and the small, to those close by and those physically far away. Saint John Paul II was remarkable for his love of justice, but his love for justice was a desire for justice completed by mercy. And so, John Paul was also a man of mercy, because justice and mercy go together. John Paul, who did so much to promote devotion to divine mercy, believed that God's justice had this face of mercy, this attitude of mercy. John Paul II died carrying a heavy cross. He carried it with dignity, but he also carried it according to the principles of Catholic bioethics, refusing disproportionate means when his time to go to the house of the Father had clearly arrived. Remember, John Paul II was a good shepherd to us all, as are all men of Christ. It is up to those remaining to pick up the torch and carry it further down the road of Christ. The teaching of Pope John Paul II about sickness and death came not only from his speeches, addresses, and encyclicals. He instructed just as convincingly with the witness of his own faith in the face of injury, suffering, hospitalization, illness, and dying. He gave this catechesis for years. He taught us that to understand death with dignity, we must first accept the dignity of life. Human dignity is an undeserved gift, not an earned status. The dignity of life springs from its source. We come to be by the loving action of God the Creator. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him little less than a god, and crown him with glory and honor. The dignity of life is beyond price. We have been ransomed not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. The dignity of life is clear from our calling. God's plan for human beings is that they should be conformed to the image of his Son. For God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of his own eternity. All who respect their God-given dignity are called to be heralds of a culture of life. Christ's mission was to every human person, and our Lord had a passionate concern for the sick, the suffering, and the dying. In our own time, Christ continues his mission and his preference for the vulnerable through his church. Christ looks mercifully upon us now and at the hour of our death, and the church proclaims solidarity with our brothers and sisters at the end of their earthly journey. The church is a patient advocate working to ensure proper care for the sick and dying by promoting respect for their dignity. The church is physician and nurse, the Good Samaritan who treats the wounded and abandoned and never walks by. The church is also the innkeeper who provides the hospital, nursing home, and hospice for care and comfort. Pope John Paul II, who was no stranger to sickness and suffering, raised the prophetic voice of the church compassionately, often insisting on the care that is due to the sick and dying. We Catholics have prayed for the grace of a happy death from a sudden and unprovided death. Deliver us, O Lord.